Hi everyone, welcome to another video going over some basic media studies stuff. Today's video, I'm going to have to apologise first, we're not going for a walk today. The reason being that I've got someone fixing my shower at the moment, so there might be some background noise in this video. It was really weird, my shower screen just exploded at 2 in the morning, sending glass everywhere. No one touched it or anything like that, it just literally just blew up. Waking everyone in the household up, so we're almost convinced that this place is haunted now, so that could be an interesting twist on this video. But today what we're going to be doing in response to a couple of requests is going over some basic newspapers stuff today. So the newspapers module revolve around a really interesting context called Partygate. Now, Partygate is linked to the COVID pandemic, and basically the basic premise behind it is we all remember how horrible COVID was and all the lockdowns that we had to go through. There was a lot of tragedy in this country. So 205,000 people died of COVID over the 3 years that the pandemic existed in the UK. And in one of the steps to try and stop the pandemic spreading and turn it into an even worse disaster than it was, the government put in several lockdowns, which I'm sure you'll remember. So 205,000 people died, obviously, as we're aware of, and a lot of those people who did die in hospital died alone because COVID laws and lockdown laws basically prevented people from visiting their family members as they were dying in hospital. At the same time that this was happening, it emerged that the Prime Minister and several other Conservative MPs were having parties, lockdown parties, when they shouldn't have been, basically. So these guys, including Boris Johnson, were breaking their own laws that they'd established to try and prevent the spread of coronavirus. Now, this scandal got branded Partygate, and that is the context around which we have to understand our newspapers module. So a lot of people who are kind of younger aren't that interested in politics, but unfortunately you do have to know a few bits and pieces of politics for this module. It's not particularly in depth. The basic premise is that you have to understand the difference between left-wing ideals and right-wing ideals. So the left wing is generally the political ideology that a lot of younger people kind of subscribe to. So left-wingism is kind of like liberalism, right? So there's a lot of really interesting ideas that exist on the left wing. So the idea of like everybody looking out for each other is a left-wing ideology. So things like the NHS are a very left-wing idea. Giving women the right to abortions is a left-wing idea. Communism is a left-wing idea. It's an extreme one, but it is a left-wing idea. On the right wing, we have ideas like traditionalism, right? So conservatism is basically traditionalism, keeping things the way they were. So in the past, it was only men and women who were allowed to get married. You didn't have like same-sex marriages or anything like that. In the past, men would go out to work and women would stay home and look after the kids. That's a very traditional idea, and that's considered a right-wing idea. Now, left and right wing are where we're going to kind of put our political parties, right, moving forwards. So as a bare minimum, what you have to understand for this module is that the Labour Party is kind of on the left and the Conservative Party is on the right. Okay, so right wing, Conservative Party, left wing, Labour Party. Now, newspapers in the UK and across the world actually will pick one of these sides and sit firmly on them, and this is usually linked to who owns the newspapers. So for now, all we have to be aware of is that the Mirror, which is one of the set Eduqas texts, one of the set Eduqas newspapers that we have to study, the Mirror is a left-wing newspaper and always has been, right? It's a very left-wing newspaper. It looks after the people. It's quite anti-royal. It's very anti-conservative. It's fairly liberal in its ideals. The Times, which is the other newspaper that you have to study on Eduqas, is neither of these things. So that confuses things quite a lot. The Times is actually a neutral newspaper, so it doesn't take a left or a right-wing perspective. It remains entirely neutral, okay? It just gives forward the news. It doesn't give forward any political ideals. And that's something we'll come on to in a little bit. Now, another bit of information that we need to understand in order to get anywhere with this module is the different types of newspapers that we can encounter. So in the UK, there are basically 3 types of newspapers that we have to be aware of. First one is the tabloid, and you can see examples of tabloids by doing a Google image search result for the Sun front cover or the Mirror front cover. These are tabloid newspapers. Some general features of tabloids is that they tend to communicate soft news. You don't get what's called hard news in a tabloid, you get soft news, which is generally like celebrity focused, scandal focused, like salacious, easy to understand news. Tabloids will tell their stories through a lot of images rather than a lot of copy, which is what we call text, like written text in media studies. And it's very kind of gossipy, right? They're generally seen as being targeted at the working classes. They don't require a high level of education in order to understand tabloid news. They're often kind of printed for entertainment purposes rather than any sort of information reasons. In the past, way back in the past, we used to also get a type of newspaper called the broadsheet. And a broadsheet is the exact opposite of a tabloid newspaper. It's very hard news focused. So broadsheets will put forward a lot of hard news. What this means is it's a lot of political and economic news. It's can be quite difficult to understand, very heavily copy based, so very text based rather than photograph based delivery of information. And they're called broadsheets, or they were called broadsheets because they were massive. Like they were a literal broad sheet of paper, like a great big broad sheet of paper. Now we don't tend to get them anymore. Broadsheets have evolved into what we're going to call mid-market newspapers or quality newspapers, which is somewhere in the middle, right? There's a lot of copy and it's quite hard news, but it's not like as gossipy as a tabloid, and it's not as broad as a broadsheet. It's a bit smaller than a broadsheet. So out of the 2 newspapers that we have to study, you need to be aware of the following. The Mirror, that is a tabloid newspaper. It's soft news, it's quite gossipy, it's quite sensationalist. The Times is a mid-market newspaper. So it used to be a broadsheet, but now it's evolved into mid-market. So it's harder news, it's more fact-based, and it's less gossipy than a tabloid would be. So one of the main skills you're going to need to get your head around with this module is basically looking at newspaper front covers and saying why they are the way they are. So it's kind of a context-based thing for the newspapers module. So you need to be able to look at the Mirror, the front cover of the Mirror, and say it looks that way and it presents news that way because of this reason. You need to do the same with the Times. It's presenting the news in this way, and these are the reasons why it's doing it this way. Now I'll do a video when I have a computer. I'm not just editing these on my phone from my office space. I'll do a video doing a deeper analysis into the front covers that the exam board have given you. But for now, I'll kind of talk you through some of the context you have to be aware of for the Mirror and the Times to understand why they present the news the way they do. So the Mirror is owned by a company called Reach PLC, but that hasn't always been the case. In 2018, it was still owned by a company called Trinity Mirror Group. And Trinity Mirror Group were a left-wing company. They presented left-wing ideals and their newspapers reflected this. So the Mirror has always been very anti-conservative or anti-Tory and has always been very pro-Labour and pro-left-wing. Now in 2018, when Reach PLC bought the Mirror, the thing they wanted to do was basically make money off of buying the Mirror. Reach PLC is a conglomerate. It's a massive company that's hugely horizontally integrated. It owns pretty much every local newspaper in the whole country, and it owns a couple of national newspapers, including the Mirror and the Express. Weirdly, the Express is a right-wing newspaper, and Reach PLC have kept it a right-wing newspaper because it already has this established right-wing readership, and they didn't want to lose that. The Mirror has a left-wing readership, and Reach PLC did not want to alienate these people by suddenly changing it to be right-wing. So they kept it very, very left-wing, and as a result of this, they have very anti-conservative headlines, and you'll see this in the set text that is saying that Boris Johnson has zero shame due to the Partygate scandal. The reason that they've kept it this way, like I said, is to try and make money. So Reach PLC is a conglomerate, and as we understand, like when we think about the works of Curran and Seaton, we know that conglomerates want to do two things. They want to expand on their power, which they do by buying up lots of companies, buying up lots of media assets, which is what Reach PLC did when they bought the Mirror. They expanded on their empire, and they want to make profit, which is achievable through targeting existing audiences, targeting mass audiences. So they keep everything quite mainstream. They target a huge amount of people. It's just that these people are very, very left-wing in their ideals. Now, what's very interesting is that the Times newspaper, it's a bit of a ladder here in terms of its companies, but the Times newspaper is owned by several companies. So if we have the Times, the physical Times newspaper, that is owned by a company called Times Newspapers, right? So that's the company that publishes them. That is owned by a company called News UK, and News UK is owned by a company called News Corp, right? Or News Corp. And this ultimately is owned by a guy called Rupert Murdoch, who's a billionaire. He's a media tyrant. He made all of his money off buying up newspapers and turning them into profitable machines, right? So ultimately, the Times is owned by a conglomerate. So that suggests, according to Curran and Seaton, that suggests that the Times' main goal is to try and make money. And they're quite clever about how they do this. So the Times newspaper does not alienate anyone. It stays entirely neutral, right? And it does this through a number of different techniques. One of the things it does is it employs journalists who are left-wing, and it employs journalists who are right-wing as well. And this is called journalistic plurality. Try and say that again, journalistic plurality, which is where you have journalists of both sides of the coin, right? They stay very, very neutral, so that they don't alienate half of their audience, as like a left-wing audience or a right-wing audience. So without going into too much depth and without getting into really deep analysis, I think that is probably all the basic information we need to understand the newspapers module. This isn't the last video I'll do on newspapers. I'll do some more, 'cause it's a big old complicated module and it's quite an ugly one as well. So I'll do some more videos on that at some point to give you more in-depth kind of focuses on certain areas. But for now, this is all you need moving forwards. Keep getting in touch with me, let me know what type of videos you want to see me make, and I'll do my best to make some more for you guys. Thank you, bye.